All right, so welcome to the second video where we're going to discuss how urine is made, how filtration happens, and the processes that regulate this. So this video is going to be a little longer than the first one, but there's just a lot of information to go through, and so that's pretty much the case there. So we just want to make sure we go through all of it so you understand this process. Okay. So in the first video, we talked about the structures of the kidney and the structures of the nephron, both the nephron tubules and the blood vessels that are associated with that nephron. Now, filtration happens from the blood to the nephron, where the kind of initial filtrate can begin being processed by the nephron. And then there are other reabsorption processes that occur later in the nephron tubule, so in like the proximal tubule and the distal tubule, that return a lot of the filtered fluid and solutes back into the blood. And so we're going to talk about how that happens. Okay, so when the blood is brought in from the renal artery, it enters the afferent arteriole and moves into the capillary bed known as the glomerulus, which is in that glomerular capsule. Now the filtrate is pushed through those capillaries into the glomerulus and is then transferred through the proximal tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal tubule, and into the collecting duct. Now that filtration that happens in the glomerular or in the glomerulus filters waters, ions, glucose, amino acids, bicarbonate, and other waste products like urea and creatine. Okay. Now, larger molecules aren't filtered in this process, so things like proteins, that sort of molecules aren't filtered in the glomerular capsule. Now, once that filtrate enters the glomerulus, or enters the capsule from the glomerulus, it then travels through the proximal tubule. And in the proximal tubule, that tubule comes into contact with the capillaries. All right, so the peritubular capillaries, remember, that go around the proximal tubule. It's a little easier to see in this image. And so there's a tubular reabsorption that happens there. So a lot of the water and amino acids and ions are reabsorbed from the proximal tubule into those peritubular capillaries, so it can re-enter the bloodstream. Remember, we said that there is like 180 liters that is filtered in this filtration process. Most of that goes back into the bloodstream, and this is kind of how it happens, through that tubular reabsorption. Now there's also a tubular secretion where some other waste products, some medications, drugs, chemicals, that sort of thing, and other ions that are secreted through an active secretion process, so using energy, from these peritubular capillaries into the distal tubule. And those products, those molecules and ions will be secreted in the urine. And so ultimately the formation of urine follows these three processes. So glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. Right? We've already defined these in that last slide. Here it is in word format, so you can just kind of pause this and write them down if necessary. Now, glomerular filtration, like we said, filters the plasma fluid from the capillaries, and it doesn't filter larger molecules like the proteins. This is a very large volume of filtration, like we already mentioned, around 180 liters per day, but it's selective in what it filters. So no large proteins, no large cells, only the smaller molecules and ions. And that filtration process is driven by a higher blood pressure in the glomerular capillaries. Okay, and so that rate of filtration can really be regulated by two different ways, two different mechanisms. So the resting rate that adjusts the diameter of the afferent arterioles, which affects the blood pressure, and then stress that causes the sympathetic nerves to reduce blood flow to the kidneys. you reduce blood flow, you reduce filtration. And so basically you have a larger afferent arteriole that's kind of pushing more blood into this glomerulus, and then a smaller efferent arteriole that's moving less blood. So you get a higher pressure in the glomerulus. And then, so because of that high pressure, it's pushing the filtrate out of the pores and the spaces in the capillaries. So remember, capillaries are only a cell layer thick. They have those pores and gaps in between the cells. And so that allows that filtrate to come out. And again, it's smaller molecules, protein and cell-free filtrate that will then enter the capsule and enter the proximal tubule. And what's also interesting is notice on the proximal tubule, there's a lot of surface area. So there's the microvilli, the villi that are on those cells, kind of really similar to what we saw in the digestive system. And so again, that helps with the absorption and diffusion of a lot of the filtrate back into the bloodstream via the peritubular capillaries. And so if we look at the different types of substances that are filtered per day, 180 liters of water, and you're only excreting about 1 to 2 liters per day. So that's about 99% being reabsorbed. You also look at the amount of ions, bicarbonate, glucose, urea, creatine that is filtered versus what's reabsorbed. Almost, all of the bicarbonate, all of the glucose is reabsorbed, half of the urea, all of the creatine is excreted, none of it's reabsorbed, and then most of the ions are reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. And so even though it filters a lot of material, we're only excreting a very small amount of that. And the kidneys are really effective in regulating how much is excreted and how much is reabsorbed so that we maintain that homeostasis state. Now, tubular reabsorption happens after the glomerular filtration, and that returns the filtered water and solutes back to the blood. 100% of glucose, amino acids, and bicarbonates are returned, and 50% of the urea is returned to the bloodstream. And most of this reabsorption happens in that proximal tubule, so before it goes through the loop of Henle. So water reabsorption, so 65 to 70% is in the proximal tubule, 25% in the loop of Henle, and then less than 10% in the distal tubule. But the distal tubule and collecting duct is really important in water excretion regulation because these structures determine whether or not the urine is concentrated or diluted. And we'll talk exactly how that happens here in a little bit. And then we also shown how there's microvilli in the proximal tubule cells to help with that reabsorption process. Okay. So here's a micrograph of a proximal tubule. You can see the microvilli, you can see the nuclei and the lumen, so where the filtrate's coming into contact with the microvilli, and the interstitial fluid that the filtrate's going to go through. So that reabsorption is going to move through in order to get back to the peritubular capillaries. And so the tubular reabsorption, basically you have sodium being moved out of the filtrate via active transport into the interstitial fluid. Sodium then will diffuse from the interstitial fluid into the capillary, and this creates a concentration gradient favoring the diffusion of sodium from the lumen to the tubule. Okay. And then chloride will passively move with the sodium because of those charges, because of sodium being positive and chloride being negative. So you have this active diffusion, active transport of sodium that leads to a passive transport of chloride. Then your water will diffuse from the lumen to the proximal tubule to the interstitial fluid and then to the capillary. And then the movement of that sodium is providing energy to actually transport glucose and amino acids from the tubule into those adjacent cells. And then the glucose and amino acids move into the interstitial fluid, and then into the capillaries. So basically, this figure summarizes those processes. So you have sodium actively being transported into the interstitial fluid, diffusing into the capillary, and that brings about the movement of, so it sets up that gradient where sodium will diffuse into the cells. Okay, so this is a passive diffusing from the lumen into the cells of the proximal tubule. The active transport is from the cell to the interstitial fluid. Okay, but that gradient is set up by the active transport so that that passive diffusion can happen. And then the kind of ultimate movement of the sodium into the capillary brings the chloride with it. And then water will passively move, diffuse, because of the concentration gradients of the solutes. So high solutes here, low solutes here, so water will diffuse. And then the energy from the passive diffusion, the passive diffusion of sodium into the cell moves the glucose and amino acids into the cell. So that's an active movement. Again, the energy from the sodium ion is providing that energy for the active movement. And then the glucose and amino acids will passively diffuse into the interstitial fluid and into the capillaries. Okay. Now, tubular secretion will remove other substances from the blood. So this is tubular reabsorption, right? So this is getting substances, wanted molecules from the filtrate back into the blood, while this process removes unwanted substances from the blood into the distal tubule. So this is materials moving from the paratubular capillaries back, or so the paratubular capillaries or the vasa recta to the tubule. So this helps to regulate specific chemicals in the body and gets rid of harmful chemicals. So things like drugs, and then any preservatives in our food, and then ammonium, potassium, those types of substances. Now, our bodies can produce a diluted urine or a concentrated urine, depending on how much water is present in our body. So if there's a lot of excess water, our kidneys will excrete it. If there is not a lot of water, our kidneys will conserve it so that our bodies have the appropriate amount of water volume. Now, the way the kidney regulates diluted urine versus concentrated urine is through the distal tubule and the collecting duct. So the distal tubule is impermeable to water. So water is not reabsorbed in that structure of the nephron. Sodium chloride, though, is reabsorbed, and it allows that to happen without water being reabsorbed because it's impermeable. And so you get a high volume of diluted urine being produced. Okay, so basically what happens is whenever you need to excrete excess water, the distal tubule and the collecting duct is impermeable to water reabsorption. So you're reabsorbing all of these solutes, right? And so a lot of water is being excreted. So diluted urine, so a large amount of water. Now, if you have too little water in your body, say you're dehydrated, you can have a lower blood volume as a result because of the low amount of water in your body. And the kidneys respond to this low amount of water volume in the body by conserving water and producing a concentrated urine. And the way this happens is a hormone will detect, or the pituitary gland will detect that the water volume in the body is very low, and so we need to conserve our water. And so it will release antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And the body will release it from the pituitary gland. And then the ADH will tell the collecting duct to allow water to be reabsorbed. So all of a sudden, the collecting duct is now permeable to water, and water will be reabsorbed because of the high amounts of solute that are in the area surrounding the collecting duct. Because remember, the NaCl is being reabsorbed while water is not. So there's a lot of solutes here and a lower amount of water. So if the collecting duct becomes permeable to water, then your water will diffuse out via osmosis because of the amount of solutes. So it will go to the high amount of solutes. So you get a low volume of urine that's extremely concentrated. So if you've ever been dehydrated, you know that your urine will have a dark yellow color, almost like apple juice. And that's not what you want, right? You don't want a darker urine because that means your body does not have a lot of water, and so it's producing concentrated urine. You want a clear urine. You want your urine to be pretty clear, which means that your body is getting rid of a lot of water. And so that means that you have a healthy amount of water volume in your body. And so you don't want to over drink water, because that could cause issues too, but you want to drink enough water to where your urine is diluted and not going through this process of, oh crap, I need to conserve water because our body is low on water. Now, urination also depends on a reflex. So the process of urinating, once the urine has been made, is based off of a specific reflex called the micturition reflex. So this is a reflex that enables the bladder to be empty. Basically, it responds to stretch receptors that are in the tissues of the bladder wall, and the internal urethral sphincter and the external urethral sphincter. So the internal sphincter is a smooth muscle. The external sphincter is actually a skeletal muscle that's under voluntary control. Now you can feel the urge to urinate, and we can kind of control when that happens. However, the brain can override that reflex and control the timing of urination. And if you say try to hold your bladder and it gets very full, if you try to hold your urine and the bladder gets very full, the stretch receptors will increase. The amount of stimuli will increase, and the body will know the bladder is getting really, really full. And so that voluntary control becomes more and more difficult as those stretch receptors expand. And so you only can control that micturition reflex to a certain extent, and then your body will eventually override it. Now, the kidneys, they maintain homeostasis in several different ways. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to stop the video here. I know I initially said we'll do 2 videos, but I think right here is a good stopping point. We can actually separate it into 3. And so we'll finish up talking about, with this chapter, how kidneys maintain homeostasis through the production of the ADH hormone, etc. And then we'll talk about some diseases and finish up with that can happen with the kidneys. Okay. And so with that, we'll finish up the 2nd video here, and then we'll have a 3rd and final video that will go through the rest of the chapter. Okay. And so we'll see you in that final video.